Now, you might find this speech not exactly adherent to the title, but this is due to some kind of misunderstanding, but I think it will not be bad. It will not be bad to explore principles and ideas behind technological alternatives to mechanical ventilation. That is, we have to do our job of critical care physicians, and so to do the right job, we need the right tool. So you heard a magnificent speech from Goran. I was not here, but what is mechanical ventilation? Mechanical ventilation is an artificial organ to substitute or support the respiratory muscle. However, the mechanical ventilator was not designed to take care of a diseased lung. It was designed to take care of a diseased respiratory muscle or of a diseased or paralyzed mechanical pump. Many years ago, now exactly 30 years ago, Colombo, Gattinoni, myself, and a few others, we were reviewing why the use of artificial lungs did not achieve an improvement in survival, and that was 30 years ago. And so we wrote that we believe that severely diseased lungs have a chance to heal only if the environment remains conducive to the healing of the lung. This environment, this healing environment, does not consist of high airway pressures, high tidal volumes, high PEEP, IFiO2, etc., etc. So the point I like to discuss with you today is just a point of view, is a set of ideas. I don't have clinical data to put forward. I have some evidence to put forward. And what I want to do today is to show you what is beyond mechanical ventilation as an alternative to mechanical ventilation. Because I think this helps us to understand what mechanical ventilation is good for. We know that mechanical ventilation is not a cure for the diseased lung. Mechanical ventilation is not the cure for ARDS. At best, it just keeps the patient alive. Mechanical ventilation in itself is just an application of a device that helps us in keeping the patient alive. Is not the best support for the lung. We've even learned that mechanical ventilation might be dangerous for the lung, what we call barotrauma, biotrauma, and it may also be dangerous for the patient because it might be causing systemic inflammation, multiple organ failure. We have a lot of data in this direction. And my final contention is that the CO2, if we can control CO2 elimination or production, we will be able to control the need for mechanical ventilation. As a matter of fact, you all know that the higher the amount of CO2 we have to eliminate, the higher the required alveolar ventilation. So we will not be in need of using the mechanical ventilator if we do not need to breathe out CO2. So let's go back to the basics ideas. in critical care, we substitute organ function. When the ventilatory function is impaired, then the mechanical ventilation is the appropriate organ. But when the parenchymal, the gas exchange function is diseased, then the mechanical ventilator is not the physiological answer. The physiological answer is more complex, and it might require a membrane lung. Obviously, the mechanical ventilator has proven effective. It improves survival. It keeps the patient alive for time being. It's the best we have for time being. But this monster is called Cerberus, is a monster with 3 heads. Mechanical ventilator comes with 3 evils, which are ventilator-induced lung injury, ventilator-associated pneumonia, and the need for sedation. So mechanical ventilation is not without side effects, and those side effects might be very dangerous. Now, I like to concentrate on the ARDS patient. What is an ARDS patient? It's a patient with a refractory hypoxemia, with low VAQ regions. He has deranged respiratory mechanics. He has what we have been taught to think about as a stiff lung. We rather think we have a small lung, a small baby lung with a reduced functional residual capacity or a reduced lung volume. We also have high ventilation to flow ratio regions that cause dead space. We have a high dead space, and we might also have an increased metabolism. Now, we know how to take care of the ARDS patients. We think we know. When the patient is hypoxic, we increase FiO2 and airway pressure. For low-end expiratory lung volume, we increase airway pressure. For high VAQ ratio, we increase minute ventilation. High dead space, we increase minute ventilation. High work of breathing, we use mechanical support. Usually, intubating the patient, particularly the acute patient. Now, this is a very old slide, but I think it's always good. A normal man has 2.5 liters of ventilated alveoli. Its minute ventilation is less than 7 liters per minute. So each liter of alveoli receives less than 3 liters of ventilation per minute. In ARDS, just as a proportion of the lung is ventilated, as you all know, so the functional residual capacity is often lower than 1 liter. It means we have less than 1 liter of ventilated alveoli. We ventilate them with 15 liters per minute, so each liter of alveoli receives more than 15 liters per minute. And that is true. Data from all the studies around, from clinical experience, data collection, show that this is the ARDS net study, low versus high tidal volume. Both arms of this randomized study were ventilated with more than 13 liters per minute. That is more than 2 to 3 times the basal ventilatory needs of a patient. Now, what's this slide? This slide is human data from positron emission tomography studies. I don't want to spend time on PET studies, but what does it show? This study from Bellani showed that if you measure inflammation in the lung, you see that the regions in which the tidal volume to FRC ratio is higher are more inflamed. That is, ventilator-induced lung injury, you can measure it in vivo as inflammation. You can measure inflammation by PET. And inflammation is higher where the tidal volume change is higher compared to FRC. So the higher the ventilation compared to the ventilated volume, the higher the ventilator-induced lung injury. Why do we need a lot of ventilation per unit alveoli? Well, because we have an increased anatomic dead space, because the airways are dilated by the positive airway pressure, because we have a shunt, and the shunt in itself causes an increased dead space. Because if we have shunt, we have to ventilate more. You might not expect that, but this is a schematic representation of a lung. We have dead space here. Alveolar dead space is a region that is ventilated but not perfused. Then we have two ideal regions. Each one receives 2 liters of ventilation and the same amount of blood flow. From both these two regions, the blood enters with 49 millimeters of mercury PCO2 and exits with 43 millimeters of mercury PCO2. Because these are two ideal compartments. Now look here, total ventilation is 8.5 liters and arterial PCO2 is 43. Now, I do not change the CO2 carbon dioxide production. Simply, I get pneumonia in this lung, and the lung is not ventilated anymore. Now, PCO2 of the blood, of the venous blood, is still 49. If I want to keep arterial PCO2 at 43, it's not enough that I increase the minute ventilation of this region 2 times. Because if I want to have 43 millimeters of mercury on the arterial side, I have to have out of the good lung a PCO2 lower than 43, because I am going to mix it with the venous blood. So I have to increase this ventilation, that is, increase the VAQ ratio and increase dead space. So shunt causes an increase in dead space. The RDS lung in itself has high VAQ regions. We can measure them with inert blood gases, but keep in mind that the RDS is not just an alveolar disease. It is also an endothelial and vascular disease. We have extensive microvascular occlusion in ARDS. Pulmonary hypertension is an hallmark of ARDS. And this is a pulmonary angiography performed in an ARDS patient, and you see that we have no peripheral branches in this branch of the pulmonary artery. Microvasculature is very much occluded, and this causes, again, an increase in dead space. Dead space means that we have to increase minute ventilation. So I have an answer to why do we need these patients, to ventilate these patients 15 liters rather than 5. Because they have a very high dead space, because of all those pathophysiological derangements I just finished to show you. But alveolar dead space means high ventilation, once again, and high ventilation means ventilator-induced lung injury. Dead space, for this reason, because it means, between other things, ventilator-induced lung injury, dead space is one of the best predictors of mortality in mechanical ventilation. This is the relationship between the dead space fraction and the mortality, always on the ARDS network database. So dead space is a good measure of how diseased is the patient and how much ventilation do you need to maintain your normal PCO2 in your patient is a good measure, again, of how diseased is the patient. Conclusion. Carbon dioxide elimination is the true target of ventilation, as you know. The impairment of CO2 elimination is easily measured by dead space. Dead space is a global index of lung function. But please keep in mind that bad CO2 elimination means risk of ventilator-induced lung injury. Again, Marco Ranieri and his group showed that even if we use small tidal volumes, lung protective ventilation, less than 6 milliliters per kilogram, in at least 30% of patients, we get hyperinflated regions that are depicted in red in this picture. You see, this is end expiratory at PEEP, a CT scan at PEEP, and you see that the red is not much. This is end inspiration with 6 milliliters per kilogram, and you see a lot of red regions that are regions in which, once again, the ratio of local tidal volume to end expiratory volume, that is tidal volume per unit volume, is high and the lung gets over-distended, even when the tidal volume is on the protective range. So, how can we avoid ventilator-induced lung injury then? Well, the perfect solution is never to ventilate, but that is not always possible. CPAP is a good way to handle patients, but not all patients can be handled by CPAP, by non-invasive CPAP. Then we have non-invasive ventilation. This is a study by Antonelli, and it shows that you can apply non-invasive ventilation to acute respiratory failure patients, hypoxemic patients. You see that the basal PO2-FiO2 ratio is in the range of 100. So these are hypoxemic patients. Then some of those stay on non-invasive ventilation. Many fail non-invasive ventilation. Can we predict or can we identify the patients that are not going to withstand non-invasive ventilation? The number usually cited is the change on PO2-FiO2, because the difference, see, patients that do not get intubated increase their PO2. Patients that get intubated increase too their PO2, but less than the patient that stays on non-invasive ventilation. But as a matter of fact, if you look at respiratory rate, you see that the patients that stay on non-invasive decrease their respiratory rate from 35 to 27, while those that have to be intubated go only from 36 to 30. And as a matter of fact, the change in respiratory rate is much more significant in identifying patients that have to be intubated than the change in PO2. It means that what differentiates the patients that has to be intubated from the patient that can avoid intubation is the response in terms of respiratory drive. And here is not PO2 at play in determining the drive. I guess is more PCO2 and respiratory work. So if we can control CO2, we can avoid mechanical, we can act to avoid or delay mechanical ventilation, or to avoid or delay intubation, guided by the idea that no ventilation means no ventilator-induced lung injury, no intubation, no ventilator-associated pneumonia. And we have many slides around from many different centers showing patients spontaneously breathing under extracorporeal CO2 removal or extracorporeal oxygenation. This is a patient on a non-invasive CPAP. This is what the CPAP applied by helmet, and the patient could withstand non-invasive CPAP thanks to the extracorporeal CO2 removal. The story of extracorporeal CO2 removal is not new. What is new is that the technology has much improved. This is a study from 35 years ago by Kolobov, Gattinoni, and friends, showing that when we remove CO2 by an extracorporeal lung, minute ventilation goes down very quickly and goes down even to zero. When we remove the entire CO2 production, the animal in this case does not need to breathe anymore. This is in men. These are patients being weaned from ECMO. And this is a study, it's very old too, might be 25 years ago, measuring the ventilatory impact of CO2 removal on patient breathing. Because on the membrane lung, rotating a knob of the gas flow, you change the amount of CO2 removed. And you can see that the two line crosses. When the removal by the membrane lung goes down, the ventilation, when the removal by the membrane lung goes up, the removal of CO2 by the natural lung, that is the ventilation, goes down. The more CO2 we remove with the membrane lung, the less the patient ventilates. This was done in pressure support. So now we can envisage a very attractive alternative between an intubated, sedated, mechanically ventilated patient, immobile in his bed, and a spontaneously breathing patient connected to something like a CVVH system that is not intubated. He can speak, he can read, he can interact with the world. The first experience we had with this approach goes back to this patient we published in Anesthesiology. It was a patient, it was a young girl with a bilateral pneumothorax because of cystic formations in her lung, and she had massive bronchopleural fistulas. We applied small cannulas, 400 milliliters per minute. This was the lung. After a few days, she could breathe spontaneously. Now we have advanced technology. This is the arteriovenous lung that is perfect to remove CO2. I don't like getting a big cannula into a big artery. I rather prefer this new model from the same company with a pump to apply a venous approach. This is very attractive, but I have just seen pictures of it. This is called the A-lung. It's a small machine with very small tubes. The picture shows a very happy patient in his bed that, rather than being ventilated, is connected to this kind of dialysis machine. This machine has been tested in India. I think it's under testing in Germany and Spain now. Probably Professor Quintel knows some more than I do about it. This is the system applied in Torino by Terragni, Ranieri, and the people at the Molinette. They apply an hemofilter in series with a membrane lung. The blood flow is 400 milliliters per minute, and they could decrease. In those patients that I showed you were hyperinflated and at risk of ventilator-induced lung injury at 6 milliliters per kilo, they decreased tidal volume to 4 milliliters per kilo and could maintain, by extracorporeal CO2 removal, PCO2 at a constant safe level and pH at a constant safe level, in spite of a ventilation at 4 milliliters per kilo. So we are many people are working on a device able to control PCO2 at very low blood flows, lower than 500 milliliters per minute on a VV bypass. Something very simple, like a renal support system, to avoid intubation as far as possible and to decrease mechanical ventilation as far as possible. We are working on a acid-facilitated CO2 removal device. What limits the CO2 removal capacity of a membrane lung is the partial pressure of CO2. If we had an acid, a very friendly acid, like lactic acid, which is very quickly metabolized by the body, before the membrane lung, then we will convert bicarbonate to gas PCO2, and the partial pressure will increase very much, increasing the transfer. We've done quite a few experiments in animals, and we have been able to show that by infusing lactic acid before the membrane lung, we can increase CO2 transfer 70%. In this experiment, as an example, with half a liter blood flow, we could reach a CO2 removal per minute of 180 milliliters. It means that we could be able to avoid 100% of ventilation by running half a liter of blood flow per minute through a machine like this one. Obviously, we have no human experience with this, but in animals it works quite well. So the future I'd like to see, and the principles I would like to see applied, is that we could prevent ventilator-induced lung injury using an ideal device that uses very low blood flow, comparable to dialysis, to remove between 50 and 80% of the total CO2 production, with regional anticoagulation, and perhaps apply it also in chronic patients that fail non-invasive ventilation, because the reasons to fail non-invasive ventilation there are, even besides hemodynamics, are even more strictly connected to PCO2 and respiratory drive than in acute patients. This is a very bad slide. It shows a young man that wants to shave, but to shave properly, we have to select the right tool. This is probably not the safest way to shave. In some movies, you see people shaving using this tool. But it's better if you go to something else. Select, please. To do the job right, you have to use the right tool. Thank you very much.